Hi fantasy fiction fans, and welcome to Myth and Magic, a fantasy writer's kit bag. I'm fantasy writer Neil Mack, the author of Moondog and the Reed Leopard, and I want to share my love of folklore, local history and nature mythology with writers and creatives like you on my regular podcasts. It's designed with fellow indie publishers and writers in mind, but all fans of fantasy fiction are very welcome to join in. In my fantasy writer's kit bag, writers, artists and creatives will find lots of ideas and discussion about things such as potions, dark arts, fabulous creatures, folktale studies, nature lore, and the interesting history behind the myth and magic that underpins our understanding of the fictional universe. Hello, fantasy fiction writers. Still working on my bonalizing my NaNoWriMo project, which is going to start on the 1st of November, 50,000 new words. Funny enough, I'm not going to be writing fantasy fiction. Well, maybe it's got a bit of fantasy in it. There's certainly some world building going on, and that's one of the reasons I wanted to discuss this week, creating toponymy for your notional world. So, let me start by telling you about where I live, which is Staines, down by the river on the west side of London, close to Windsor Castle. So when the Romans came to Britain as a peacekeeping force in year 43 AD, under the Emperor Claudius, with about 4 legions, which is about 20,000 men, they started to map out the territory for military and logistical purposes. And whilst they were mapping out the territory, they sometimes came upon place names that were unfamiliar to them, mainly because the place names were decided by the Celts, who, as I discussed in the previous episode, had no written language, although they passed their story down word of mouth. Anyway, on some occasions, the Romans, when they started to map and create place names of Britain, retained some of the old Celtic names, such as Thames or Thamesis. And it's thought that this was because some ancient names, like Thamesis, had magical powers, or were connected to antediluvian spirits or special deities, and it was best not to anger these spirits or deities. Don't forget, the Romans were very superstitious, and this is something that they'd be careful to avoid. Anyway, when the Romans came to my riverside town, it wasn't called Staines in those days. It may have had a Celtic name, we don't know. But they decided it would be a sensible place to cross the River Thames, and there's a reason for that. Further up, the River Thames becomes braided, so there's lots of threads of the Thames, so it would be hard to cross all of them. But at the place they decided to stop, the river was still one thin river. Further on down towards the estuary, towards what we call London now, which wasn't a city in those days, it was nothing more than just a few hovels put together according to the Romans. It was too wide to cross. A bit further up, near Brentford, there was a place where you could take across chariots and horses because it was shallow. But at the place they stopped, which happens to be my hometown, the Romans realised they could build a bridge. They could build a bridge to an island and then another bridge connecting the island to the south side. So they called the place Ad Pontes, A-D-P-O-N-T-E-S, which is Latin for at the bridges. When they crossed the river to the south side, they probably found a thriving port on the south bank. And it might have reminded them of the small yet bustling harbour that they'd already discovered as they'd come over from the continent at a place called Romney Marsh, which is on the south coast of Kent. And this place that they'd found, this harbour which they probably used, is known as Hythe, or was known as Hythe, Hythe, which probably means landing place in an ancient tongue. And the river port that they discovered at Ad Pontes, once they'd built their bridges and they'd gone over, also had a port, so they named it Hythe. Now, all of the above is more or less historically accurate. Perhaps I did a bit of conjecture, because we don't really know whether the words Thamesis and Hythe originate in the Celtic language. But we do know that the Romans tried to preserve sacred place names like Temes's and Hythe, because if renaming them would cause protests from the Celtic inhabitants of the place, then obviously that would cause problems for their peacekeeping mission. The Celtic people that had invited them over, by the way, were called the Ad Pontes. And Ad Pontes means inhabitants of the place. So these Ad Pontes had a few place names of their own, although they didn't write them down, because as far as we know, they had no script or any maps. So we have to rely on the Romans, who were good historians, to provide us with the toponymy of the area. The toponymy just means the geography of the area. So just a short walk from Hythe, which I've just told you about, which is on the south bank of Ad Pontes, is a village known still as Thorpe, Thorpe. And Thorpe just means village or farmstead. And incidentally, if you're from England, you probably have heard of Thorpe Park, which is a major theme park which runs along the side of the River Thames, and the sort of main entrance is in Thorpe. Anyway, the reason I'm explaining all of these words to you is to provide suggestions for creating your own toponymy for your own notional world once you start your NaNoWriMo project and you're writing fantasy fiction. Because you will need to consider the fact that your toponymy will have to be justifiable and logical. So, as I've said, the Romans first named the rivers and the ports and the bridges. In fact, what they did do was they named things that were important to them, important for a map, if you think about it. If you're in the habit of map making, and you're making maps probably for military and logistical purposes, and bearing in mind there were no maps before they arrived, so imagine that. They had a blank piece of paper to work on, just like you've got. Then it's fairly obvious that you need to mark off the most important landmarks, geographical features, for example, things like rivers or large mountains or huge valleys that you might want to move around or exploit. And you'd also want to mark off useful places such as harbours, ports and crossing points at rivers. So the first things you're going to put down probably on your map are the rivers, the ports and the bridges. Once these crucial features are marked onto your map, whether you're a Roman or whether you're a fiction writer, then your other places can be named too. But of course you wouldn't want lots of Hythes, and as you know, Hythe it just means a harbour, because you've already got two. The Romans already had one when they arrived and they've just named another one, and that would cause confusion. So the next landing place that you might come across or choose to name might have a grassy field alongside it, so you might describe it as Green Hythe. Or you might be able to rudder in large vessels into the port, so you might name it Rotherhithe or Rotherhithe. And when you came across other farmsteads or villages, also known, by the way, as hams, but the Romans found them to be called thorpes, you might find one which has got lots of mud, so you called it Muddythorpe, or one which is a bit yuck to look at, so you might call it Grimthorpe. We still have several hand-me-down words from the ancient Celtic language for geographical features. We still use, in geography in Britain, the words crag, cwm, corrie, broch and bog. You notice that they prefer to have one-syllable words: Hythe, Thorpe, crag, cwm, broch. I often wonder whether authors, even famous fictional authors, really happy with their original choice of place names. Once those fictional names have grown into real places in readers' imaginations, and people have even started to use them as part of their own everyday lexicons, because they become part of a shared experience of books and films, then I wonder whether authors, if they're still alive, are really happy with their original choice of names. And I'm thinking of things like Hobbiton. Hobbiton is a bit Enid Blytonish, isn't it? But at least the town was on a river and near a hill, and Tolkien, of course, was aware of the Celtic origins of place names, and of course he was very aware of the Roman influence and Roman map making. He did a lot of research before he named places. Hogsmeade, that seems to be largely a thoroughfare lined with shops, pubs and tea houses and not much else. It makes reference to a mead, but is there any field in the area which gets flooded? And why is it called hogs? Is that something to do with the barrel of beer, or is it something to do with pigs? For example, there's no hint of farmland in the description of Hogsmeade. And I'm also thinking of the fortress town of Cair Paravel, where the kings and queens of Narnia ruled from. But it doesn't have much going for it, does it, Cair Paravel? It's a place, incidentally, which seems curiously similar to King's Landing, which is the royal capital of Westeros and the Seven Kingdoms, although at least King's Landing has a sacred site within it, and also it's a harbour. So while you're on your city and town building, and while you're thinking about toponymy for your fantasy world, and before you even name your towns, try to think about the following things. And these concepts, by the way, will be fairly familiar to anybody who uses or used to play Settlers or Civilization video games. So think about this. Why is the city there? What purpose does it serve? Does it have a special function? And if it doesn't, then how does it thrive? And for example, the real hive is and was an important river port. Is your city or town a market town? Does it trade or supply precious minerals? Is it the centre for some kind of food or valuable materials? Is it an important sacred site, like King's Landing, for example? Does it have a holy well that perhaps contains healing waters? Or is it a place where holy men consult an oracle? Or is it a place where kings and queens are crowned? Also ask these questions about your town. These questions may help you to name your town. So where do citizens buy and sell produce? Where do citizens store their foodstuffs, for example, their grain? What do citizens do all day? Do they work on the land? Do they work down in mines? Are they merchants? Are they fishermen? How do people get to and from the town? Is it by a river? Is it by road? Is it by sea? Is it by some kind of transmutation device? What happens if citizens get ill? Where do citizens learn? Where do citizens pray? Where do they dispose of their waste? Where do they dispose of their corpses? What powers the city? What energy does it have? Who maintains the law and order? Is it the police? Is it a militia? Is it the church, like it was in my first novel, The Last Music Bearer? Or like the sparrows in A Feast for Crows? So, creating toponymy for your notional world. Locus in quo. Old Windsor. Now, you've heard me talk about Windsor as in Windsor Castle on previous shows, but I've not touched upon a place called Old Windsor. We tend to drive through this little town on our way to visit the Queen's farm shop. And yes, really, she does have a farm shop. It's just along the road from us. And as you can imagine, it's quite expensive, but you can get some very high quality organic produce in the shop. In fact, I think the produce is grown on her estates here at Windsor. But anyway, back to Old Windsor. It's a kind of plain looking place, sort of unlovely, and without being ugly per se, the way I describe it is it's just a through road with some social housing, a few roads leading off of it, a couple of dreary looking pubs, and a line of featureless shops. So why am I talking about it? Well, the village was originally called Windsor. That's the first thing to think about. In fact, Windlesora means winch by the river. And we were just discussing toponyms, so that's why I thought it is relevant. So the place we now know as Windsor, i.e. where the castle is and where the Queen lives, wasn't Windsor then. That place, the place we know of, and the castle place, grew up when the Normans started to build the huge medieval castle, which is still there today, very imposing. And I suppose it was then called New Windsor, although eventually it became the real Windsor, the Windsor that everybody talks about, the Windsor where the royal weddings take place. And once it became the real Windsor, then the place called Windlesora became Old Windsor. So, still thinking about toponymy and town building, we have to ask ourselves, why is Old Windsor even there? What purpose did it serve, and did it have a special function? Well, yes, it turns out that Old Windsor was once the site of a very important palace for Saxon kings. Archaeological evidence suggests royal connections from before the 9th century, which means the subsequent Windsor Castle, real Windsor, and our seat of sovereign power in the realm is actually planted in an area that had already been deemed as special, and perhaps even sacred. Windsor had royal significance right from the very start, and so that's probably why King William the Conqueror, built his predominant castle here. He built it here because that's where the British folk expected it to be. They expected his centre of power to be here at Windsor. Old Windsor was probably popular with the monarch and his government because of its convenient location. So thinking of toponyms again, it was near the river for transport. It was near to Hythe, which I mentioned just now, for bringing in goods and supplies. And it was near to the vast and very secluded Windsor hunting forest, which they enjoyed spending time in. Old Windsor was an early minster location too, as well as being a market town. And it probably also included an important riverside mill complex, so it was a bit industrial. And we're talking about industry in the 9th century, or perhaps before. And a minster, and the minster location, means a minster is an honorific title given to a superior church that has a royal foundation. The word is consistent with the Latin for monasteries, monasterium, and that indicates a church that might also have a charter house. Although in the case of minsters in Britain, it's not necessarily cloistered monks who live there, but more usually men and women who were involved in missionary teaching. Anyway, there are over 30 minsters in Britain. 2 of them you've heard of before. Westminster, which is talked about every single day on the news, and York Minster. York Minster is an important administrative centre, and as well as being the second most important church, high church in the Church of England. And Westminster is the seat of government even today. Other minsters that have been preserved in place names, such as Upminster, Axminster, and Kidderminster, don't really have a minster anymore, and Old Windsor Minster seem to have been lost in time altogether. And I'm going to continue to research into that, and I'll come back to you directly. I'll find out more about Old Windsor Minster. At the moment, I don't even know where it was. Anyway, at the southern end of Old Windsor is the historic Beaumont estate, which was first recorded in about 1300, when the estate and the lands were under the ownership of Sir Hugo de Rimanum. The estate was acquired in the mid-18th century by Sophia, Duchess of Kent, and in 1751 the estate was bought by the Duke of Roxburgh for his son the Marquess of Beaumont, who renamed it Beaumont Lodge. The chapel at Beaumont Lodge is said to be the inspiration for the chapel in Evelyn Waugh's Bridehead Revisited, and we know that the English writer served with the Royal Horse Guards in Windsor whilst he was in the armed forces, and he went out to visit Beaumont Lodge. The parish church of Old Windsor is probably built on the chapel attached to the original hunting lodge of Edward the Confessor. And the other thing I ought to tell you about Old Windsor is that Windsor Great Park is largely within the bounds of the town. So the Royal Lodge, which is home to Prince Andrew, the Duke of York, who's been in the news recently, and Cumberland Lodge, which is now run as an educational charity, but was once lived in by Queen Victoria's daughter, Princess Helena, as well as various members of the Churchill and Marlborough family, can both be said, both Royal Lodge and Cumberland Lodge can both be said to have Old Windsor addresses. Myth and Magic News. This week, the American business magazine Forbes have published an issue that lists their choice of best young adult fantasy novels of all time. The Forbes list includes A Wrinkle in Time by Madeleine L'Engle, Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone by J.K. Rowling. This was chosen because Forbes say this is the book where magic in Hogwarts properly begins. The epic fantasy The Book of Three by Lloyd Alexander, and this draws on Welsh mythology. The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien, which I think is the easiest of Tolkien's books to get into, so that doesn't surprise me. The Last Unicorn by Peter S. Beagle. The Dark is Rising by Susan Cooper. The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe by C.S. Lewis. The Golden Compass by Philip Pullman. Redwall by Brian Jacks. And A Wizard of Earthsea by Ursula K. Le Guin. So what's your thoughts on the Forbes list? Do you agree or do you disagree with their claim that these are the best young adult fantasy novels of all time? What novels would you add to their list, and which ones would you take out and why? Let me know by tweet. Magic word of the week. This week, therianthropy. So, therianthropy is the mythological ability of human beings to metamorphose into other animals by shape-shifting. I used the concept in my most recent novel, Moondog and the Reed Leopard. The word derives from the Greek therion, meaning beast, or actually it means wild beast, and anthropos, which means human. Therianthropy has long existed in mythology and goes back as far as prehistoric cave drawings. One such cave drawing, known as the Sorcerer, that was found in a cave at the Trois Frères in France, is one of the most important and curious cave paintings of the type. The painting is at least 40,000 years old and seems to represent a two-horned half-man, half-beast, known as the Great Spirit or Master of the Animals. Is this the earliest representation of the horned god that I have already discussed in Myth and Magic episode 2 and episode 3? Anyway, there are suggestions that such cave paintings are actually attempts by the people of the time to depict shamans, shamans who are in the process of acquiring the mental and spiritual attributes of the various beasts. And I'll discuss shamans in another episode. Back to therianthropy. The transformation of a human into a wolf or werewolf is probably best known as lycanthropy. And I'll probably go into this in greater detail in another show. Also very popular is synanthropy, which is transformation into a dog, which I covered in my first novel, The Last Music Bearer, and allianthropy, which is transformation into a cat, which I hinted on in Moondog and the Reed Leopard. In fact, the Reed Leopard is one of these shape-shifted mythological cats. African legends describe people who turn into lions or leopards, while it's interesting to note Asians and Asian werecats were typically depicted as tigers. So depending on which part of the world you come from will depend on what you think the human turns into. Some Native Americans and First Nation legends talk about skinwalkers, and these are people who have the supernatural ability to turn into any animal they desire, as long as they wear the specific pelt of that animal. So this is a bit like the shaman that I mentioned earlier. If the shaman put on, for example, the horned god's mask and two antlers, does he acquire the mental and spiritual attributes of those beasts? In Melanesia, there is a belief that the tamaniu, or atai, is an animal counterpart to a person. So each human has an animal counterpart, often a eel or a shark or a lizard or some other creature. This creature is corporeal. In other words, it has a body, it can understand human speech, and it shares the same soul as its master. And because it's a counterpart to a human, this creature will share the same death and injury as his or her host. And I wondered if this is the idea behind the daemons in Philip Pullman's fantasy trilogy, his Dark Materials. Therianthropy. Have you used this technique in your fantasy fiction? Let me know. Fabulous creature of the week. This week, the Selkie. In Scottish mythology, Selkies, or Selkie folk, or Seal folk, and it's sometimes spelt S-E-L-K-I-E, but often spelt S-E-L-C-H-I-E, are creatures who are able to put on or remove their animal skin to swim or walk on land. Malcolm South of the mythical and fabulous creatures fame lists them under the general heading of mermaids. There are counterparts to the Scottish mythology in Faroese and Icelandic folklore. These stories speak of seal women and seal skin. And before I go deeper into the Selkie, I just want to talk about Finns, F-I-N-N-S, also in Orkney folklore, sometimes known as Finnfolk, and very, very closely related to Selkies. Finnfolk are described as sorcerous shapeshifters of the sea. They're a dark and mysterious race who come ashore and remove their furs before they plunder. And Finnfolk are neither romantic nor friendly, like Selkie folk, because they rob and they abduct. And it's worth thinking about the fact that the tribal name Finn, as in the people who come from Finland, probably originates in or around AD 98, although fur slavers from Finland started to make their presence felt from the late Iron Age onwards. Now, imagine if you were an Iron Age person or somebody in the 1st century AD, and you saw a fur-clad hunter emerging from the sea. Perhaps the hunter had arrived in a kayak made of sealskin, and this fur-clad hunter had perhaps the head of an eagle, or the head of a wolf, or the head of deer, and he was armed with knives and axes. What would you think? Anyway, back to Selkies. A common folktale is that of a man who steals a female Selkie's skin, finds her naked on the seashore, and compels her to be his wife. This folktale normally ends with her disappearing again after a few years, often 7 years. And I think the folktale has a lot in common with tales of the Swan Maiden, which I covered in episode 2 of Myth and Magic. But Selkies also come in male form, and the male Selkies are said to be very handsome, and they employ great seductive powers over human women. One etiological theory, and you can hear my comments about etiological myths in episode 2, but one etiological theory is that before the advent of modern medicine, many physiological conditions were untreatable, and so when children were born with abnormalities, such as a hereditary growth of skin between their fingers that made their hands resemble flippers, or they were born with scaly skin, or perhaps they were born with an unusual amount of body hair, then this was explained away, especially on remote islands, such as in the Orkneys or the Faroes. It was explained away as the child being a descendant of a Selkie, though antiquarian David MacRitchie believed that the early settlers in Scotland probably encountered, and they probably even married, Finnish hunters, Finnfolk that I mentioned earlier, who were misidentified as Selkies because they came to their waters using sealskin kayaks and they were dressed in furs. Although there's also a strong body of law that indicates that Selkies are not Finnfolk, but actually they are supernaturally formed creatures from the souls of drowned people. A Stranger Came Ashore by Scottish author Molly Hunter, published in 1975, is a young adult horror thriller set in the Shetland Islands, and it's about a boy who must protect his sister from the Great Selkie. Fabulous creatures, the Selkies. Wildflower of the week. This week, Bulrush. I've been lucky enough to acquire a mini Bulrush. Note that it's B-U-L, just one L in Bulrush. And I've planted it in my little garden pond. And I've been delighted to see, over the last few days, a green spear has emerged from the depths. So it's taken okay. So the roots of the bulrush are underwater, quite a long way down. But this little green spear's pushed up out of the water. Maybe I'll put a link for the picture on the show notes. Anyway, eventually I hope that the top of the what they call cattail grass develops that characteristic brown plume that you've probably seen in pictures from things like Wind in the Willows. Anyway, bulrush is the vernacular name for several large wetland grass-like plants, and these are all from the sedge family. And Cyperus is one of the largest specimens, and it contains the famous papyrus within it. My bulrush, is a mini bulrush, but within the same family. Papyrus has been used by humans for centuries to weave, and that's sleeping mats mostly, and to eat because it's got edible tubers, and to spice food because once the roots are dried it adds a piquancy to food, and in folk medicine, and perhaps most importantly of all for us fantasy fiction writers, to make paper. The Ark of the Bulrushes, and this is the container that carried the infant Moses down the Nile, and to read about that you need to see the book of Exodus, was probably woven from bulrush stalks, most likely papyrus stalks, and coincidentally baby Moses was found by Pharaoh's daughter in amongst the rushes. Sargon the Great, who was the first ruler of the Akkadian Empire, and is also known as the Scorpion King, was also discovered in similar circumstances. Papyrus sedge was cultivated by the ancient Egyptians to make a thick paper that can be rolled into scrolls. And we know that they were using papyrus for paper as far back as the 26th century BC. So these common rushes have the closest possible connection with the written word. And in fact, biblos, which is a Greek word but was used to describe the inner part of the paper plant, papyrus, lends itself to the English words beginning with biblo, such as bibliography, bibliophile, and even Bible. And papyrus, the Greek word for the outer part of the paper plant, of course gives us our word paper.